So I took on the task of should education count by actually thinking about numbers and considering if and how numbers should count or do count in critical policy analysis. So I'm talking about numbers, counting oftentimes people. And so critical policy analysis aims to challenge inequalities by understanding the roles that policies play in perpetuating them. And by policies, I'm talking very broadly speaking. It's not just like a government decision, but it's what people do and how they act in various places, as well as decisions made by formal authorities. So in order to try to do this work, I look at who influences policy and how do they do it, how are policy texts constructed, how are policies created and appropriated in different places, including schools, and I look at the outcomes and the effects of these actions and enactment on individuals, communities, society more broadly, as well as democracy. So to try to connect critical policy analysis and the question, should education count, I would say yes, sometimes education should count, and I'm talking about numbers specifically, because I've found in my policy work that numbers can sometimes reveal key parts of an overall policy story. However, in none of the cases that I've looked at do numbers really tell the whole story, but that they can tell a piece. So I'm going to just pull from a couple of examples from my own research, as well as the research that I've done and do with other people to make my point. So some of the examples of where I think education should count has to do with highlighting areas of systemic inequities and inequalities. So I think specifically around the issues around safe schools policies and how there's been real resistance to breaking down numbers, in particular by racialized groups or students with special needs, in terms of who's suspended and who's expelled. But I do believe that doing that is important for being able to identify patterns of inequity, in particularly because we know that those people who are suspended or excluded in other kinds of ways, they have higher rates of unemployment, less social support, higher incidence of substance abuse, and inequities are recreated through society. But of course, numbers can't tell the whole story. So if we see that suspensions are down, or exclusions are down, then I feel my job is then to ask, well, why? Is this because there's some programmatic changes that are really leading to changes in behavior of teachers or students? Or is it just the case that there's more push-outs and exclusions that aren't being reported, but they're still going on? Or is it that there's just more in-school suspension? So I think that the numbers helped raise new questions rather than answer ones. This also, I think, points to another key concern, is that not counting sometimes can be really a political strategy for hiding what other people might consider an important policy problem. So I think numbers can be used to construct or to illuminate or hide policy problems. So in the case about not wanting to break down large numbers by race or other groups, then there's the argument, well, if there's no numbers, then there's no problem. There's no evidence of the problem. In a second case, I've been working recently with a graduate student, Kim Carter here, whose master's research looked at the teacher workforce and different groups of people within the teacher workforce. And we talked about how hard it is, again, to get numbers, and what does that mean. But Kim's research and research of other people suggest that there are systemic inequities within the school system that leads to different groups being represented or over or underrepresented in the teaching workforce. So one of the questions, another example, I'm always interested in who participates in policy processes. So I believe that there should be wide participation in public policy making, that many people in general should be able to participate in making the decisions that affect their lives. So I think that sometimes looking at how many people or how many groups were involved in policy decisions can reveal something about the process. I think that But it's not the case that more people who are the same and think the same is necessarily better. So it's also looking at the range of perspectives. And even when there's a greater number of perspectives included in a policy consultation or discussion than, say, another time, we still need to ask, was every perspective heard and considered equally within the dialogue? And then another example was, I work with People for Education a lot, an advocacy group in Toronto, and I think some important research they've done that looks at counting has to do around the issue of fundraising. And just I think it's helped illuminate the vast differences in the amounts of funds that are being raised in different schools across the province. So just finally, I'll provide two examples of where I think education should not count in the work that I've done. My earliest formal graduate work was looking at character education policy, and I noticed that a lot of times, how many trips to the office is used like as an indicator of good character. So if there's fewer trips to the office, then that means character education is working, and that's so I guess from the last you would agree with me that that's probably not. I would argue that's not a good reflection of kids' character, but perhaps of some kind of successful behavioral control, or what sometimes people don't want to consider is that it's kids' strategic responses to programming. And finally, I pulled out the example of parent involvement because I worked for a while in the Ministry of Education on a project where we had to develop these parent reaching out grants, which are still around. But a really key indicator of showing that the money was well spent is that you had to be people who applied for these grants had to demonstrate that they were reaching more parents, and that this was typically done through counting how many parents showed up at events. And I think that counting how many heads in the school is not a good use of numbers, particularly in the area of parent and community involvement, because as John mentioned in his video clip, we know that there's really the most important, much of the important work that goes on in relationships to education and schools and families happens outside of the school building, so it can't be captured in those kinds of numbers. So in conclusion, to the question, should education count? I would say yes, sometimes, because what is counted and what is not counted can inform critical policy research, but it's as a means to raising new and deeper questions rather than in answering them.